So we now come into part 4, which is general authorizations. And the first amendment we have is TD 20, which relates to page 41 in the bill.
Yes, this one applies to contractors acting on behalf of a person authorised under the Cannabis Act, and it would clarify that contractors are authorised to perform activities on behalf of a person authorised under the Cannabis Act, such as a licence holder, as part of their contractual obligations and in a manner consistent with the conditions that apply to the person's authorisation. It would also clarify that agents and mandatories can be individuals or corporations. This new provision works alongside the existing provisions respecting employees, agencies and mandatories. Moved that Bill C-45 in Clause 71 be amended by A, replacing lines 23 and 24 on page 41 with the following. Agents and mandatories this Act. 2, unless the regulations provide otherwise, every person who's acting as the agent or mandatory of a per. B, adding after line 30 on page 41 the following. Contract to this Act. 3, unless the regulations provide otherwise, every person who's acting under a contract with a person that is authorised under this Act to possess, sell, distribute or produce cannabis, other than an employee or agent or mandatory of the authorised person, may do anything that is prohibited by any provision of Division 1 of Part 1 if they do so in the performance of their contract and in a manner that is consistent with the conditions that apply to the authorised person's authorisation.
TD 20, and it's linked to the next one too. TD 20, is that agreed on division? Carried. TD 21.
So this is consequential. TD 21, that Bill C-45 in Clause 72 be amended by A, replacing line 33 on page 41 with the following. Is prohibited by Section 8, 9 or 10 if they do so as. B, replacing line 37 on page 41 with the following. Agents and mandatories, provincial acts. Every person who's acting as the agent or 2, every person who's acting as the agent or mand. C, replacing line 40 on page 41 with the following. Section 8, 9 or 10 if they do so as part of their role as. D, adding after line 3 on page 42 the following. Contractor provincial acts. 3. Every person who's acting under a contract with a person that is authorised under a provincial act to sell cannabis, other than an employee or an agent or mandatory of the authorised person, may do anything that is prohibited by Section 8, 9 or 10 if they do so in the performance of their contract and in a manner that's consistent with the conditions that apply to the authorised person's authorisation.
Okay, TD 21, anything else on this? Okay, is it agreed? Carried on division? Okay, now, in Part 4, General Authorizations, the question is, shall Part 4, entitled General Authorizations, which contains clauses 69 to 72 as amended, carry? Agreed? Carry on division. Well, now I get a bit of a run here. Up until the next amendment doesn't happen until Division 2 of Part 9. So let me just go through the script here. Shall Part 5, entitled Ministerial Orders, which contains clauses 73 to 80, carry? Carried on division. Part 6, Cannabis Tracking System. Shall Part 6, entitled Cannabis Tracking System, which contains clause 81 to 83, carry? Carried on division. Part 7, Inspections. Shall Part 7, entitled Inspections, which contains clauses 84 to 86, carry? Carried on division. Part 8, Search Warrant. Shall Part 8, entitled Search Warrant, which contains clauses 87 and 88, carry? Carried on division. Part 9, Disposition of Seized Things. Okay. Shall Part 9, entitled Disposition of Seized Things, which contains clauses 89 and 90, carry? Carried on division. Part 9, Division 1, non-chemical offense-related property. Shall Part 9, Division 1, entitled Non-Chemical Offense-Related Property, which contains clauses 91 to 101, carried? Agreed? Carried on division. Part 9, Division 2, Cannabis and Chemical Property Clauses. Now, here we come to JS 13. On page 70 of the, all the way up to page 70 now of the bill. Senator Seaton.
Thank you, and this adds a new clause, 109.1 to page 70. So, a little background. Canadian Chiefs of Police told the Legal and Constitutional Affairs Committee that they believe Bill C-45 requires law enforcement to keep seized cannabis plants alive in certain cases while judicial decisions are pending. The Legal and Constitutional Affairs Committee heard evidence that some police services and municipalities may not have the capacity to store seized cannabis-related products, or cannabis plants. Imagine keeping the cannabis plant alive, you know, watering it every day, right? The Canadian Association of Chiefs of Police have said that greenhouse facilities would need to be built to keep large numbers of cannabis plants alive. This amendment that I am about to make would relieve law enforcement agencies of all responsibilities regarding the conservation, return, or compensation for seized cannabis plants. And this amendment comes from the unanimous recommendation of Legal and Constitutional Affairs Committee's report on C-45. I will give you a quote from Mario Arel, who's the president of the Canadian Association of Chiefs of Police. The CACP has significant concerns regarding the return of property provisions, which appear to require police to maintain and return seized cannabis plants. Police services across Canada do not have the facilities or resources to accomplish this. Accordingly, we ask that the proposed legislation address these concerns by relieving police services of any responsibilities associated with the deterioration of seized cannabis plants and from having to provide compensation to the owner. It is therefore proposed to amend the bill to relieve law enforcement agencies of all responsibilities regarding the conservation, return, or compensation for seized plants. And it's for the plants here, so just so you understand. So I move that Bill C-45 be amended on page 70 by adding the following line after line 16. 109.1. A peace officer, inspector, or prescribed person who seizes, fines, or otherwise acquires cannabis in the course of the administration or enforcement of this act or any other act of Parliament is not obligated to maintain or preserve it.
Okay. Yeah.
If they needed to have it.
And it doesn't say plants.
I suppose that's a very good question. Who would be responsible? Clearly the police chiefs don't want to be responsible for watering cannabis plants on a daily basis in order to keep them alive so they can return them to whoever owned them. I think, and they've made that extremely clear. So that would have to be, something that was worked out.
Can the officials?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, thank you.
Officials? Okay. Who wants to tackle this one? Mr. St. Denis.
I think there may be a number of issues here that need to be addressed. One is that what the chiefs of police were concerned about was cannabis plants. This provision here concerns all forms of cannabis, not just cannabis plants. The second thing is that, if I understand correctly, the committee has just adopted the preliminary portion of Part 9, that is to say the part just before Division 1. Am I right in
Yes.
Yes, okay, well, if you look at Section 90 of the Act, it says that provisions of the criminal code, the sections 49.1 and 490 of the criminal code are applicable unless otherwise specified in the act. And the provisions of the criminal code require that property that is seized be maintained for purposes of evidence unless they are not needed. So to a large extent, property seized by police typically form part of the evidentiary process and would be needed for trial. So I think it is somewhat contradictory to tell the police on one hand, well, you can seize this, and but you're not responsible for maintaining it. So that would put the police, I think, in conflict with some of the provisions of the criminal code. Now, with respect to maintaining plants, there are already provisions in the Cannabis Act that deal with the expedited disposition of plants and other cannabis products if they're not needed for proceedings. There's also a provision allowing for the return of the plants if they're not needed. And so under those conditions, the police would not need to maintain them. They would be able to return them. Now, often enough, in cases of procedures, the taking of pictures of the evidence is sufficient to use in a trial. And so often the product that is seized will be returned to the individual because you don't actually need the thing itself. I guess the other thing is that I find it a little odd in the criminal law context, which is what this is all about, to allow the police to seize things without them being responsible for the things they seize. It could lead to some significant cases of abuse of process on the one hand, and on the other hand is that if the property, because the proposed motion here does not make a distinction between licit cannabis and illicit cannabis, so it would be possible for a peace officer or an inspector to erroneously seize cannabis that was licit, and it could be medical cannabis, or it could be part of the 30 grams that a person is allowed to possess, that would be seized. And then you would be depriving individuals of property to which they have a legal right to own. And then to then say to the police, well, you don't have to maintain that, seems to me to be somewhat contradictory with the whole notion of fairness. So to my way of thinking, there are some, I think, some considerable concerns about adopting this type of motion, Mr. Chairman.
Okay. Senator Pratt?
Just for clarification, Monsieur Saint-Denis, présentement,
Right now, when cannabis is seized, all of the cannabis is illegal right now. So right now it is destroyed after seizure. Yes, to my knowledge, that is the case, especially when there are large quantities of cannabis, that is plants, that are seized. There are samples taken of the cannabis, photos are taken after seizure, and then the plants are destroyed. Could you think of any other examples where police forces are asked to maintain or preserve something because a cannabis plant has to be watered and taken care of? No, right now in this system, any cannabis plant does not have to be kept alive. With respect to other controlled substances, whether we're talking about heroin or cocaine or others, police forces have to conserve them, have to keep them for the trial. Thank you.
Did you still want to proceed with this in view of these comments? Question? Oh, go
Or
ahead,
make
sure.
a comment, I mean.
Oh, yeah. Sorry, actually, I've got a list here. I'm sorry. Senator Petty Clerk and then Senator Platt. No?
Toutes mes questions ont été répondues.
All of my questions have been answered. Thank you.
You know, colleagues, we have had a number of committees studying this bill extensively. We have had expert witnesses at committees testifying that I believe are as expert as anybody at the end of the table here is. And they have unanimously recommended something to us, and we are considering ignoring that. This amendment doesn't say that the police have to destroy. It says they are not obligated to maintain or preserve. They are not obligated. I don't think, and maybe the RCMP at the end of the table would say that they would just ignore the criminal code. I don't think they would. I have a feeling that if they were obligated under criminal code to maintain something, they would do it, even if this bill says they don't have to. The bill doesn't say they have to destroy anything. It says they are not obligated, and surely they will not break the criminal code. I think we have an obligation to take the advice of committees that have studied this extensively, have had expert witnesses. We have great people on the legal and constitutional affairs, legal and constitutional experts, and we are doing a disservice if we do not consider those recommendations very seriously. So I certainly support this recommendation.
Senator Seidman?
Yeah, and I do have the report, you know, even though we have Senator Pratt in the room who sits on that committee. I do have in my hand the 23rd report of the Standing Senate Committee on Legal and Constitutional Affairs. And recommendation adopted by the committee unanimously, recommendation number 3. Amend the bill in order to relieve law enforcement agencies of all responsibilities regarding the conservation, return, or compensation for seized cannabis plants.
Okay. Anybody else on this? Okay. Question, Senator Langton?
Yeah, sorry, I heard Senator Seidman, I heard you say cannabis plants, and as has been pointed out, and as I noticed, that this just says cannabis. So it's broader than your intent.
Right, and that could easily be the fault of the law clerk. I didn't write this amendment, so he was given instructions to write an amendment in accord with item number 3 from the Legal Affairs Committee, and this is what came from it. So I would be fully prepared to put cannabis plant, to amend this amendment, and put cannabis plant in there, after cannabis, cannabis plant.
Okay, so you're adding that into the amendment, cannabis plant. Senator Gold?
Thank you, Chair. Just, as a member of the Legal and Constitutional Committee, I appreciate Senator Platt's confidence in us, but we didn't, and we did our best, but we are hearing additional considerations and concerns from the officials, which, at least to my mind, has given me pause about at least the scope of the amendment that is before us. Thank you.
Yes, Mr. St. Denis, we now have cannabis plant. Is your comment still the same? We solved one problem, but you've still got the other one.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. A number of my comments were related to the broader issue of maintaining evidence, whether that's cannabis plants or cannabis.
Right.
But certainly reducing the focus to cannabis plants would limit some of the sort of consequential harms that may be caused by this amendment. But I would like to point out, though, that some of my concerns would still exist with respect to medical cannabis plants, which patients are entitled to possess, and if they're accidentally seized, they would lose. So that concern remains.
Yes, okay. Senator Munson?
Well, I'd like to ask the RCMP the question if they have a point of view on what was heard before the Legal and Constitutional Affairs Committee. Do you have a point of view on this amendment?
As I had earlier stated to the same committee, I think on Friday, the CACP, I think, has correctly pointed out the limitations on police with this, with respect to facilities and resources around the live plant issue. So respectfully, I think I would just leave it at that.
Okay, Senator Stuart Olson.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for all of this. And as usual, Senator Munson, you picked a little. But I think we have to put some common sense into what we're asking the police officers to do. And honestly, are we really asking them to build greenhouses and water plants? So I think there has to be another way around it, and if we amend this, then I think another way around it will be found. I think prosecutors will find a way to collect that evidence, and I just don't think that asking them to maintain a bunch of cannabis plants is even logical.
We have a comment coming from Ms. LaBelle.
To restate, there is a disposition scheme under the Cannabis Act. It's not all that different from the one under the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act. So there are means by which law enforcement can ask for these cannabis plants to be destroyed. The other concern, so in other words, it would be kind of displacing a lawful regime for lawful disposition. And another concern I would have, and with all the respect that I do have for anyone in law enforcement, there are instances where something may not be in good faith, and it is unusual for the Crown to take a position of immunizing behavior without knowing what kind of behavior we're giving immunity to.
Okay, can we get to the vote now? I might add, Senator Bernard has returned. She's taken over from Senator St. Germain. Okay, so I need to get an indication whether you want to adopt this amendment or not. All those in, pardon?
Sorry, could I just clarify one thing before we take the vote?
Yeah.
So, as I said, the law clerk wrote this, and I have been informed that there was much discussion about this amendment and using cannabis as opposed to cannabis plant. And what was said by the law clerk is that cannabis includes cannabis plant. Just
saying, do you want to change this to cannabis plant or leave it as it is?
well, you know, when the law clerk writes
Okay.
an amendment,
Well, all right.
I hesitate
Let's
to
go.
change it on the fly
Okay.
without consulting the law clerk.
All right, well, let me
So-
take the vote as JS 13 as it's written. All those in favor? Well, oh, sure, okay. JS 13, recorded vote.
The Honourable Senator Eggleton?
No.
The Honourable Senator Bernard?
No.
The Honourable Senator Dean?
No.
L'Honourable Sénatrice Mégy?
No.
The Honourable Senator Munson?
Yes.
The Honourable Senator Omidvar?
No.
The Honourable Senator Patterson?
Yes.
L'Honourable Sénatrice Petitclerc?
No.
The Honourable Senator Platt? L'Honourable Sénatrice Poirier?
Oui.
The Honourable Senator Seidman? Yes. The Honourable Senator Stuart Olson?
Yes.
Yeas pour 6, nays contre 6.
It's lost on a tie. Okay, so that's the last one for that section, right? I'm in Part 9, Division 2, and I'm asking you, shall Part 9, Division 2, entitled Cannabis and Chemical Property, which contains clauses 102 to 109, carry? There's no amendment. Carry? Is that agreed on division? Okay, on division. Part 10, Administrative monetary penalties and TD 22 in that connection.
Fix moved that Bill C-45 in clause 112 be amended by A, replacing the French version line 22 on page 71 with the following. C, les efforts raisonnables que l'entretien a déploie afin d'atténuer. B, replacing in the French version line 26 on page 71 with the following. L'entretien a retiré de la violation commise.
Okay. TD 22, any further comments? Is that agreed? On division, carried. Okay, so that's the last one in that section, or do I have, where do I have this? The next one comes up in the next section. Okay, so I'm dealing with, shall Part 10, entitled Administrative Monetary Penalties, which contains clauses 110 to 127 as amended. Carry. Is that agreed? On division, I take it. Okay, Part 11. We do get into some more amendments here. Part 11 is general. Oh, that covers everything. Under that, I have JS 14. So, JS, let's see then.
Thank you. So this calls for 2 new clauses, and I'll give you some background. The committee heard that appropriate regulations will need to be developed in a number of areas, including requirements for the packaging and labeling of cannabis products to ensure that the risks and harms of cannabis are appropriately addressed. Furthermore, the government has indicated that it intends to add additional classes of cannabis to Schedule 4, such as edibles and vaping liquids, to allow time for the development of specific regulations to address the unique risks posed by these product classes. The committee heard evidence that in areas where the government intends to enact regulations, the devil is in the details. This amendment would give the option for the House of Commons and the Senate to take 30 sitting days to review the proposed regulations expected next year for edibles and vaping products in the appropriate committee before they are enacted. Given the degree of concern we heard about the packaging and type of products, a concern about public safety, especially for kids, this is the sensible thing to do. There is ample precedent for amending legislation to introduce greater parliamentary oversight. This amendment would introduce a degree of transparency to the regulatory process for edibles and vaping products next year and beyond for new classes of products without delaying the implementation of the Cannabis Act. It also provides a high degree of flexibility to the government in cases of emergencies or technical amendments. Given the testimony our committee heard about the growing commercialization of the cannabis industry, introducing an additional degree of transparency without tying the government's hands is the sensible thing to do. It is therefore proposed to add a provision to Bill C-45 to stipulate that proposed regulations applying to additional classes of cannabis, such as edibles or vaping liquids, be laid before each House of Parliament and be referred to an appropriate committee, which may choose to conduct inquiries or public hearings with respect to the proposed regulation and report its findings to that House. And then, as I said, these would be new clauses, 139.1 and 139.2 on page 87. And so I move that Bill C-45 be amended on page 87 by adding the following after line 31, 139.1 parenthesis 1. The minister must, before a regulation is made under subsection 139 parenthesis 1, in respect of any class of cannabis added to Schedule 4 after the day on which this act receives royal assent, including any class of cannabis added to Schedule 4 on the coming into force of Section 193.1, cause the proposed regulation to be laid before each House of Parliament. 2. Each proposed regulation that is laid before a House of Parliament is, on the day it is laid, to be referred by that House to an appropriate committee of that House, as determined by the rules of that House, and the committee may conduct inquiries or public hearings with respect to the proposed regulation and report its findings to that House. 3. A proposed regulation that has been laid pursuant to subsection 1 may be made A, on the expiration of 30 sitting days after it was laid, or B, if, with respect to each House of Parliament, I, the committee reports to the House, or double I suppose that's 2, the committee decides not to conduct inquiries or public hearings. And then 139.2 parenthesis 1, no proposed regulation that has been laid pursuant to Section 139 need again be laid under that section, whether or not it has been altered. 2. If a proposed regulation that has been laid pursuant to subsection 139.1 parenthesis 1 is made without including an alteration recommended by a committee of either Houses of Parliament respecting that proposed regulation, the minister must cause a report explaining why the alteration was not made to be laid before each House of the Parliament. 3. A regulation may be made under subsection 139 parenthesis 1 without it being laid before either House of Parliament if the minister is of the opinion that the changes made by the regulation to an existing regulation are so immaterial or insubstantial that section 139.1 should not be applicable in the circumstances. 4. A regulation made under subsection 139 parenthesis 1 may be made without it being laid before either House of Parliament if the minister is of the opinion that the making of the regulation is so urgent that section 139.1 should not be applicable in the circumstances. And 5, if the minister forms the opinion described in subsection 3 or 4, he or she must cause a report that includes the reasons why he or she formed that opinion to be laid before each House of Parliament. So, and I must remind you that it's very clear here that there's a 30-day window. So it's not that either house can sit on these regulations for an extended period of time. No, there's a 30-day window. And this is not an unusual requirement in pieces of legislation. And in fact, I do believe we find it in other acts.
Okay, thank you. So this is any and all regulations, not including the current draft ones, not just ones for
specific to
the future
ones,
edibles, relevant to edibles and
edibles
stuff.
and vaping liquids, and any other new class of product after that. So nothing that falls under the current law. So it won't hold up the implementation of the Cannabis Act at all.
Right. Okay.
It's only new products, edibles, vaping liquids, which they've promised us, and then any other new products in the future.
Senator Ahmedvar.
Thank you, Chair. Senator Seidman, you're proposing a kind of what other people have called a super regulation. In another committee, this was tabled, and it was called by someone a super regulation, and I think that describes it pretty well. I wonder if we can get the experts' opinion on it.
If I might just help you out for a bit, because I don't think there's a super regulation here. So, for example, the Official Languages Act has exactly this stipulation. The Emergencies Act, the Firearms Act, the Referendum Act, the Tobacco Act, the Canada Small Business Financing Act, the Immigration and Refugee Protection Act, the Assistant Human Reproduction Act, the Citizenship Act, the Quarantine Act, the Human Pathogens and Toxin Act, and the Canada Consumer Product Safety Act. All of those acts have precisely this request for regulations in new classes to be brought to both houses of Parliament, come before the appropriate committees, and those committees have 30 days to look at those regulations, hear witness testimony, and report back. If they don't, the regulations come into effect. That's it. That's it.
Okay, Senator Almagar.
Okay,
If you want to comment on this, is it just a policy issue, or is it have ramifications that we should hear from you on?
Well, it's a little bit of both, to be honest, Chair. I think the Senator outlined some really, I think, critical points. Maybe if I can offer a few things in response. We've talked a little earlier, and it sounds certainly like many of you are very familiar with the process that exists today. I would suggest that the reg-making process that is currently foreseen under the Cannabis Act, should it be approved, is very much in line with the reg-making process that exists today for other regulations made pursuant to the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act, so regulations for other narcotics and other drugs. I think the principles that are behind the motion around the importance of transparency, of a robust scrutiny of a public process, I think those are all laudable and appropriate. I think they also govern the reg-making process that we're under the purview of the Governor and Council that we adhere to today. I think the opportunity for Parliament's scrutiny around the legislative package in its entirety, my colleague made reference to it earlier, as a part of that 3-year statutory review, exists and does add a very helpful and I think significant ability for parliamentarians to assess and determine and recommend where changes need to be made, should they be made. And I think finally, the point about agility, which was made in the introduction, is really, really critical. I think all of you in various committees heard about unforeseen circumstances and to be prepared for unforeseen issues, whether they arise from an industry perspective or otherwise, and the ability to be able to respond with deftness and agility really is paramount. We're building this infrastructure of regulatory controls to the best of our knowledge today, but we understand there will be a considerable amount of maneuvering amongst the regulated parties. And so as the regulator, to be able to respond as quickly as possible on a variety of issues that we've talked about already and that you're very interested in, from labeling to security, record keeping, all of those regulatory details, the paramount feature will be for the regulator to be able to adapt very, very quickly to protect the public health of Canadians.
Okay, Senator Seidman.
I appreciate that, Mr. Costin. You did make, in fact, reference to the fact that I mentioned transparency, but I also mentioned a high degree of flexibility and agility, and that's built in to this amendment. So in cases of emergencies or technical amendments, there's plenty of room right here in this amendment for that. Minister has full authority to move forward if she needs to in an urgent situation, in a technicality. And as I said, there's a 30-day requirement for both houses of Parliament to do their work. And if they do not do their work in 30 days, that's it. It's over. The minister can move. Regulations can be fully enacted.
Okay. Anybody else on this? Ready for the vote?
Yeah.
Okay. A voice vote. Is this agreed? How about a hand vote? All those in favor? All those in favor of this motion, JS 14? Okay. All right.
The Honourable Senator.
Oh, do we have any? No, I already announced that Senator Bernard was back. Okay.
The Honourable Senator Eggleton, PC.
Yes.
The Honourable Senator Bernard. Nay. The Honourable Senator Dean.
No.
L'Honourable Sénatrice Meji. The Honourable Senator Munson.
Yes.
The Honourable Senator Omidvar.
No.
The Honourable Senator Patterson.
Yes.
L'honorable sénatrice Petitclerc.
No.
The Honorable Senator Platt. L'honorable sénatrice Poirier. The Honorable Senator Seidman.
Yes.
The Honorable Senator Stewart Olson.
Yes.
Yeas pour 7, nays contre 5, 5.
It's carried. Colleagues, we've been sitting here for over 3 hours now, and I think it's time for a break. It's also supper hour. It's 10 after 6. So I would suggest that we reconvene at 7 o'clock. We've still got quite a bit of work to do. So, pardon?
Say 7 o'clock?
7, that's 50 minutes, time to have something to eat and get a break, totally. Is that agreed? If you want something shorter, we can get it shorter. But, pardon? Well, half an hour? Okay, we'll reconvene at 20 minutes to 7 then. So we are recessed till 27.